And the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Hello and welcome to the only independent news and opinion program where we chronicle two distinct possibilities, either the demise and possible extinction of the Homo sapien, or the greatest leap forward in human history. One thing is certain, there is no status quo. This is the Daily Australian Radio Show, episode 60 for Friday, March 28th, 2025. My name is Jason Olborn, 50% of the show, and the other half right now, here she is, Nicola Charles. Welcome back. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday, Jason. Happy Friday, listeners. I feel like when you welcome me back, it's like welcome to country. Hello, I'm back. Yes, can't get rid of me. It's Friday, guys, so I guess we've got the weekend to look forward to, and it's pretty fantastic, Jason. People are sending me lots of messages, and they used to send messages that were quite small, and now they're sending detailed messages. So I really appreciate that, guys. Thank you very much.
Isn't that fantastic? And thanks for the response. We really appreciate it, because this show works better when the listeners are taking part in it. And of course, we don't need necessarily. I mean, we like the the confidence and the compliments, etc. But at the same time, black pill as hard as you can. That's part of the idea here. This is a debate, and we are chronicling two distinct possibilities, as we say in the intro. So it means that this thing could go either way. And obviously what we all want is for a better world, and that's why we bother to do what we do. But at the same time, we have to navigate the pitfalls and definitely the white ants in the movement that want to keep their own agenda going. And of course, it all means that what we thought we had pre-2020, we ain't going back.
No. And it's interesting because one of the messages was titled, "You're hitting the miners a bit hard," because we were talking about, all the resources getting mined out of Australia and going overseas, and Australians not seeing the profits. And I will read out this message because I think it's only fair. But just to say, this is nothing to do with the miners. This is to do with how government sells the resources. The miners themselves, I want more miners because I want us to keep mining coal for electricity. So I'm pro miners. But let me read out your message. I'll leave it anonymous. And this person actually lives up near you, Jason. So you might know about this anyway. And so I'm going to call this section every time we get this feedback in, "What say you?" Because you're having your say. And this essentially is a community radio station. So we are interested in what the community has to say. So here we go. "You're hammering the miners a bit hard. Most of the mining land belongs to the Australian government, and the miners pay royalties to both the Australian government and the state government involved, e.g. the North West Shelf 3. Revenue reported by producers from North West Shelf petroleum sales between July 2014 and December 2015 was $19.7 billion. From this, $1.9 billion in royalties was collected. The Australian government retained $0.6 billion, and the remaining $1.3 billion was paid to Western Australia. In addition to the royalties, the mines employ lots of people, both directly and indirectly. Areas around the mines are very prosperous. Singleton in the Hunter Valley a few years ago had the highest average income per capita in Australia. At 5:30 a.m, I am regularly woken by the workers streaming out of Newcastle on their way up the valley for their day's work. Skilled workers from all over Australia are flown by the companies to where they're needed on a fortnightly basis or roster, FIFO. Evidence of the mine's value to the community was when that idiot Rudd tried to add a 40% so-called super profits tax to the mine's existing contracts. It made Australia a laughingstock for any international investors thinking of investing here. the mine started to cut their staffing, FIFO's maintenance and future plans. The impact on the surrounding towns and cities was palpable. Sandvik, a Swedish company specializing in mining equipment with an international turnover 30% higher than BHP, shut their Australian head office after only just opening it in the Hunter. Their workshop had 500 employees and was closed immediately. Australia was not a good place to invest. Do you think they're ever coming back? They left a skeleton of sales guys, 2 or 3, trying to keep a couple of local steel fabricators alive with work. Your discussion of the iron ore find in WA presumes a mining company just comes in and grabs it all. As above, it's up to the government to negotiate contracts, and then, for the good of God, don't be a moron like Rudd and stick to what's been agreed. By the way, Rudd supported his idiocy by saying that the NWS contract was better for Australia than the coal miners' contract. Irrelevant. The miners spent billions to bring a mine up to full production, and while a lot of what is spent overseas by way of heavy equipment, we need to understand that infrastructure, ports and facilities will be locally sourced wherever the mine is placed. They're pouring money into the local primary and secondary, tertiary, etc., and surrounding communities. So what say you to that, Jason?
Well, I don't know where I'm picking on miners. I'll give you an example. NBN announced, this is Nine News up here in Newcastle just this week, that 10,000 mining jobs will be gone by 2030. And it interviewed the mayors of Maitland, Newcastle, and Cessnock. So they've been talking about it for years. Meryl Swanson, the current sitting member of Patterson, was on Sky News before the 2022 election and was interviewed by Alan Jones, I think, at the time when he was still there. And they were talking about the loss of the mining jobs up here due to Labor's plans to, green the area and close down all the coal mines, etc. And Jones was pushing her for where are all these people going to go. And she said, "What are you talking about, Alan? All the jobs of the future are already here. You can become a drone pilot."
Oh, yeah, that's right. You said that before. I have an idea. If we're championing this rampant migration and movement of people, I think that all these communist sympathizing politicians like Andrews and Albo and their filthy complicit media and all the Aussies who think it's fine to vote Labour, I think if you're a fan of this communist light that they're bringing into Australia, how about you take yourselves off to China permanently? I think it's a great idea. You could enjoy the virtues of being governed harder by Xi Jinping. I'm sure you'd love it very much. You'll be given endless amounts of the injections that you seem to love so much. You can experience the joy of being locked in an airtight cabin every time you sneeze. And you won't feel resentful anymore that your neighbours have got a bigger house because everyone lives in an apartment and individuality is not required. And if you go and move there, Jason, you can have all the propaganda that you love. You can eat that all up, right? Because that's what you'll get if you move to China. So anyone who's going to vote for Labour, you might as well really have a think about what you want to do in Australia. And the last one for what say you? Was regarding our discussion about Aboriginal children. It said, you mentioned Aboriginal children and their vaccines, and I believe it's a program with poor health outcomes and compromising infant immune systems like all vaccines do statistically. This is a very big issue for me and my grandchildren, as I don't have any say in what my children do, and I'm concerned they are getting the full-blown schedule, and every vaccine I look at seems to have junk science. Nearly every one of them is dangerous when I consult the FDA package inserts and check the clinical studies. Oh, Jason, if only more people did that. Most have serious adverse events, horrific in nature, and the numbers enrolled are most always too small to be statistically significant for serious adverse events, and they either have zero controls or only vaccine placebos, and the study period is too short to be statistically significant for longer term injury. Case in point, in New South Wales, they give Bexsero for meningococcal B from 6 weeks old to 12 months old for Aboriginal infants only. That is only approved under the FDA in America for age groups 10 years to 25. But the TGA has decided to approve it from 8-week-old infants for Aboriginals in Australia. 6 weeks infants and older for Aboriginal infants only based on a number of overseas studies where the number of participants were statistically insignificant, i.e., 50 and 1500, with no control placebos, and the time frame for these studies are never long-term enough to be statistically significant for serious or delayed injury. So I have zero faith in Bexsero for Aboriginal babies based on the junk science practiced by the TGA. So this is all very interesting. You know, you can tell, what I love about this is you can tell by the people contacting this show, Jason, that they are real thinkers. They are people that look at package inserts. They are people that understand scientifically that none of this stuff is making sense. So I think it's very important. You know, we said yesterday this bus driver plays our show. If people are in the habit and are indoctrinated to just adhere to authority and believe that everyone has their best interests at heart, they're in real trouble. So I think, if nothing else, if you're sitting on a bus and listening to this, I would encourage you to listen to the information, remember the information, and just, you know, like our other listeners, have a really big think about what's going on, Jason.
Well, absolutely. And look, just to go back to that mining story, and I thank both contributors for taking the time to send these stories through and the details that you've provided. But in that story, we're talking about a $19 billion mining exercise in Singleton, in my area of the Hunter Valley. What we talked about earlier in the week was a $5.7 trillion iron ore deposit in Hamersley. So we're talking 3,000 times the size. So it's a completely different concept. And when you have something that's that big, that if you were to divide up the wealth of one iron ore deposit that represented 330,000 Australian dollars per capita, you can't squander that by saying, well, once we divided that section there and that section there and that section there and that section there, the only thing left is the slippers and the overcoat, is not true. We're talking about $1 million per family in the country in combined wealth. And if we can't have a debate about that, and I'm certainly not picking on the miners and saying, well, the miners get less. I'm saying everyone gets more. And not only does everyone get more, but let's start from a position that no one has a mortgage at the age of their life. From the age of 35, no mortgages. You've already paid
Yeah.
off your house. You've
And we're
already
not
got it.
talking about not paying, you know, production expenses and wages and all that stuff. Obviously, these profits come after that. And I think it's fantastic that the mines employ all these guys. And I'd like to see more mining. I'd just like to see more mining for Australia. So the problem is, for me, is these overseas companies and overseas countries coming in and benefiting. As we said yesterday, Japan is getting our gas at a cheap rate, and we're told, oh, there's no gas, you've got to go electric, to the point where temporarily last year, the Victorian government said that all new home builds couldn't have a gas supply because
Yeah.
there's no gas, and then they had to go back on that because it was an absolute outrage. And then Japan's selling it off for a higher rate as if it's Japan's gas. I mean, what the hell is going on? Globalization is just starting to feel like a giant theft, and that makes me very uncomfortable. I'd like to see way more miners in Australia. I think it's a great job. I think you have to be very committed. These guys go away for, I think it's 6 weeks at a time. They go 6 weeks off mining and they work solidly, and then they have, you know, 4 to 6 weeks off, and then they go back again. Really interesting thing to do.
Yeah, that's it, the whole fly in, fly out scenario, and it'd be a tough place to work. But of course, people make the decision because it allows them to get ahead and also to give them a lot of time off in that break in between.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's,
big wages, isn't it? Mining, big wages.
I mean, massive. I mean, you look at the average. If the average wage in Australia, they say the median is what, $100,000 now. Good luck if you can get 2 grand a week, $500 a day, $400 a day going to
That
work.
seems a lot. I don't think that's the median anymore.
And so, but the averages, when we broke that down recently, it started to divide up very quickly. There's a lot of underemployment. It comes down to 67,000. Then you've got other scenarios. It comes down to about $40,000. So if you're in the mining game and you're earning $200,000, $300,000, I've got a neighbour nearby me in my directly in my street, and works in one of these particular roles and is on 300,000 bucks a year. Now, good luck if you can get 6 grand a week going to work, $1,200 a day. That's not a bad gig. So when people say, "Oh, but you know, you've got to do this, you've got to go away, etc.," well, that's a lifestyle choice. Good luck to you. There are many people that shift work and have to go to work when everyone else is asleep, and they rock up at work and do a shift from midnight.
Well, we're shift workers, I can tell you that on this
Yeah,
show.
yeah, we certainly are. Well, I mean, for example, today I'm up at 4:30 a.m. In the newsroom, scouring what's going on, catching up what's happening. We'll put this show together, we'll put it out, we'll upload it, etc. That'll be done by about 9 a.m. So people will be able to get that on the various different formats, of which there are many now. So we're on Rumble, we're on YouTube, we're on X, we're on Facebook,
We're on Podbean.
Podbean. So we're trying to get it out as far and as wide as possible. But tonight at 5:30 p.m., I'm off to do what I get paid for, and I will probably get home at about 2 a.m. So that's a pretty long day.
Yeah, that's rough. And
Yeah.
I have to be at my desk at 8:30 for my new job, and I work till 6. So, and also, I mean, we won't say who, but there are people out there who get these work from home sales jobs where you're on the phone and the computer. And I think, they're being underpaid, right? They're on 45K a year. They might get some commissions if they do well. And what Australians are being forced to do, it's been discovered now that there are people who are doing two, sometimes three of those from home sales jobs to get their salary up to what they're saying is the average salary.
Mm.
And I don't know how the businesses don't notice, because when you do a single job, it says, do you want this to be your main job for tax purposes and this, that, and the other. They're obviously having to say for one or two of the others, no, this isn't my main job. And for some reason, the employers are not picking up on it. But they shouldn't have to do that, right? But that's what they're doing to try and survive. And I said yesterday about people are selling sandwiches and secondhand books and all kinds of things to get by. But what it means is that we as Australians, we're having less and less time with our families and with our children. And it's really starting to grind now. Even I'm starting to feel it. My kids are older, they're older teenagers. It's not such an issue now. But the guys I work with, they've just had new babies. They've got tiny little children and they're at work all the time. And it makes me really sad, Jason.
And that is exactly where I was going, because in the interview I did with Russell Broadbent for Australian National Review, that's exactly the topic that came up. And he referred to the fact that under Paul Keating, when the finance was freed up and the housing prices boomed, but interest rates went down, it forced mum out to work. And so it was that now he said to the opposite is true. So I said to him, what would it mean to the average person if they had paid off their home by the age of 30, 35? And that's what he talked about. It's not so much going back to the 50s as such, but it's the idea that one parent can stay home and raise the children, and you don't have the impetus to have to go and both work just to try and keep your head above water in the rat race.
And
And so
there's other elements to this, Jason, because when you put families under this much financial stress, and of course there's other contributing factors, there's family breakdown, there's relationship breakdown, because I think financial stress is probably the worst stress. We all know that, and I know I try very hard in my relationship, and we've succeeded. We've found a workaround for financial stress. We're very practical about it. But then you can get the breakdown of a family, and then people end up in their second time around marriages. That's where I am. And you're essentially starting again at an older age. You're starting again with mortgages and debt. And as you get older, it's harder to get work. I was out of work for a very long time. I don't know if it's because I'm on various blacklists, I'm sure I am, but also there's ageism that then comes into play because you've had breakdown of family and your second time around and you have to start the whole process again. So I just don't know how long this is sustainable in Australia, because as you say, if that mortgage was paid off, Jason, can you imagine the amount of disposable income? What would you do with that? You'd be contributing to the economy. So, it's not working. Like I said, if you're a soft communist and you're voting for Labor, you are voting for more of this, right? Without a doubt.
you can only think outside the square in order to be able to think differently. If you are contained within the square, and that's the purpose of this show. So when we put it together a news bulletin, and if we were to only do what we were doing 5 or 8 years ago and only consulting certain sources, if you will, you have a news Bulletin, you couldn't even do a news bulletin because all we would have been talking about was COVID, 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 and when we're all losing our minds whilst in lockdown, and that's fair enough. But you have to go to the mainstream sources to see what they're talking about, and at the same time, you have to go to the absolute raw data itself to be able to determine what's really going on. So for the first time ever, there's a real boxing fight, a blue corner and a red corner, where mainstream interprets the news one way and the independent people interpret another way, but we are sourcing it from one set of facts. And now we're on virtually a level playing field. We're one step short of being fully professional, which means that we're paid, which means that instead of having to go to work to supplement our income somewhere else, we would be working in our own newsrooms full time and being able to develop it even further. The difference for us would be that our 1 hour show would be a 2 or 3 hour show, and we'd have paid producers, and we'd have a series of guests and various different segments, and we'd have breaks for commercials, etc. But we're not far from that. I would predict that somewhere in the next 12 months, it won't just be us, it'll be many different people, following a similar format. And at the same time, we're exploring different ways to present the news in a commercially viable way that we can do this. That may not be an advertising model. It may be a subscription model. It may be something else. It may be a sponsored model or some other format. So this is all still a work in progress. But I think it's important that we lay that information out there. But it's so interesting that we are now literally playing with the same set of information, but with a very different way of looking at it. And even, Nicola, within this show, we have two very distinct ways of looking at the same information.
And it's important. I think it's really important that people see and hear, and they say this to me, that it's okay to discuss and debate. There's things that you bring up that I wouldn't know anything about, as a new Australian, albeit 30 years ago, particularly with the political structure, there's stuff that you know about and understand that I don't. And also, I hate to categorize myself, but I am female, I am a mum, and I come at these things, more of the, emotional side, and you come at things, I think, more from the logical side. I think that's normal. And I think it's really important that people hear, it's okay to not understand, it's okay to be constantly learning, and it's okay to discuss. So I'd love to say thank you to all the people who constantly send messages in. Thank you so much. There was a whole heap of, just positive messages and everything else coming in, and it's now taking me, a few minutes to read through them all. And I absolutely love that feedback. And I thank you for that. So should we get onto those news headlines, Jason? I'm sure they're absolutely immense as usual.
Well, yeah, we've got plenty to get through, so let's get into it right now. Liberal leader Peter Dutton has pledged to slash migration by 25% to tackle the housing crisis here in Australia, lower the cost of gas bills, and offer a one-off cut to petrol excise if he's elected Prime Minister. He argued that this would provide financial relief faster than the tax cuts. The cost of living is the centrepiece of his election pitch, with the opposition leader promising to allow workers to raid their superannuation up to $50,000 for a house deposit and a plan to deliver cheaper gas, cheaper petrol, and rein in inflation. Dutton said a Liberal government would also invest $5 billion into essential infrastructure to get stalled housing projects off the ground and unlock 500,000 homes. Your electricity bill hasn't come down by $275, as Labor promised on 97 occasions. Rather, Australians are paying up to $1,300 more than Labor promised. After weeks of mixed messaging about the scale of the coalition's plans to cut federal public servants, Dutton confirmed all 41,000 positions created under Labor would be culled. He said the mass sackings would save the budget $7 billion a year once in place, and more than $10 billion over the forward estimates. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, meanwhile, is expected to call the federal election later today, and if not, Sunday, for a poll on May the 3rd. At least 4 people have been wounded in a stabbing attack in the Netherlands' capital of Amsterdam, police have said. One suspect has been arrested after the incident on Thursday near the central Dam Square. Footage shared on social media showed a helicopter landing in the square as 4 people, including an elderly woman and girl, were seriously injured. Police said the motive behind the attack remains unclear. President Trump announced tariffs of 25% on cars not made in the US would be levied. Critics have warned the cross-border nature of North America's vehicle industry could see thousands of dollars added to the price of a car. Really? Mr. Trump has insisted it's short-term pain for longer-term gain, and that car manufacturers would simply make more in the US to avoid the tariffs. However, US neighbour Canada would see its auto industry wrecked, has decided on a new tactic, trolling Trump's tariffs on billboards throughout the US that voted Republican at the election. Meanwhile, car manufacturers can simply set up factories inside the US to avoid the tariffs like Rolls-Royce and Hyundai have announced. Now, don't you think that a Republican would be driving an American car? Make America great again. I mean, ridiculous billboard. Auto workers for Trump founder Brian Panebecker on President Trump's tariffs said, to hear an announcement like this that's going to force the auto companies to build their assembly plants in the US instead of across the border in Mexico is music to our ears. Meanwhile, Ian Bremmer, the president of the Eurasia Group, an American high-powered consulting firm, published a detailed analysis of the state of the US's transatlantic relationship under President Trump's administration and says that he expects Ottawa will quietly fold shortly after the election to ensure that ongoing relations with the US remain functional. And the Trump administration has cut all funding to the World Trade Organization. In a major blow to global institutions, Trump has officially halted all funding to the WTO, declaring it obsolete and anti-American. And a Republican and Congresswoman Elise Stefanik's nomination to the UN ambassador has been withdrawn. Trump confirmed Thursday, with the president saying he's asked her to remain in Congress. The president's decision to pull her nomination ends 2 months of limbo for the New York Republican. Trump said, I've asked Elise, as one of my biggest allies, to remain in Congress to help me deliver historic tax cuts, great jobs, record economic growth, a secure border, energy dominance, peace through strength, and much more, so we can make America great again. With a very tight majority, I don't want to take a chance on anyone else running for Elise's seat. Federal authorities announced Thursday the arrest in Virginia of a person they described as one of the top 3 MS-13 gang leaders in the US. Authorities are yet to name him. 6 people are dead and 4 more are fighting for their lives after a recreational submarine sank off the coast of Egypt. Russian officials have said 2 of the dead are children. At least 38 tourists, all of them Russian, were on board the vessel, which sank about a kilometre off the coast of the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Hurghada on Thursday morning local time. In total, 45 people, including children, were on board the Sinbad submarine, the Sun reported, which enables viewing of marine life and coral. There are some reports that the vessel may have crashed into a reef. At least 39 people were rescued, according to a statement from the Red Sea Governorate, and 9 were injured, including 4 who've been left fighting for their lives in critical condition. What caused the Sinbad to sink is also not yet clear, and an investigation has now been launched by Egyptian authorities. A string of cutting-edge maritime innovations out of China have sounded alarms for defence analysts across the globe, with fears growing that the new technologies could be used in a potential invasion of Taiwan. Among the innovations, China has fast-tracked a large modular landing barges capable of rapidly unloading heavy equipment and new designs for cutting undersea cables, which could play a key role in the amphibious assault on the island nation that Beijing covets. And a Tesla vandal has been seen keying a Tesla in Washington, has now been identified as 55-year-old millionaire Camelia Ensler, according to the Daily Mail. In footage obtained by Jonathan Cho, Ensler was seen getting out of her car before slashing the car. Ensler is married to lead DocuSign engineer Jeff Ensler. The couple also owns a fitness company, according to public records, and they own a $1.5 billion home in Seattle. Ensler was smacked with charges of malicious mischief in the 3rd degree. And President Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, has launched a podcast row where independent podcasters will get direct access to cabinet members within the White House. Nicola.
Someone's just tweeted here on X. I haven't confirmed it, but it's a comment by Trump from the Oval Office. He's saying we're opening up our coal mines again. Very appropriate following our listener feedback this morning. We don't like the wind because we think it ruins the landscapes, the plains. It just ruins them. It looks horrible also in the oceans. So, yeah, I said about a year ago on my podcast, I said, I would actually invest, if you're going to invest in energy, I would actually invest in traditional energy because I always felt that this green energy scam would come and go. And of course, the reason these billionaires are pushing it is because they're invested in it. And I'm reasonably sure they're probably getting out of it as well. But yeah, I think we're essentially in sort of a trade war. I think it's been a trade war now for a number of years, and particularly with the prospect of Trump coming back, And everything we've gone through and all of this, not being able to earn money, I think we're just collateral damage in a giant trade war. I think it's incredibly unfair. And again, I sit here wondering, who in Australia politically is going to be able to pull us out of this and make Australia Australia centric. If we're bringing new people into Australia, and believe me, we are en masse, then we also have a responsibility to make this country strong for them, not just the original OG Australians. And so I'd like to see a Make America Great Again effort in Australia. Same letters, Make Australia Great Again, Jason.
Absolutely, and this is the point. There's a look. There's a wonderful video. I sent it to you earlier this morning. This girl has got stuck into Albo in a send up little video, a TikTok video, and in it she's talking about how Albo's distracted by what's going on with Dutton, and she says Dutton's not the leader of the opposition; it's Rennick. Rennick's the solutions, and I find that very interesting. So you can almost feel a whiff in the air. We didn't have any of this confidence in the 2022 election, despite the resistance to the tyranny that we were all facing. And of course, it was reflected in the election results. Now, another interesting one is that Clive Palmer at the Trumpet of Patriots, despite not running himself, or at least not officially running, and Sue Ellen Wrightson being the leader of that party, Clive's doing still a lot of the usual work. Now, Kobe Thatcher, an influencer on X, shared a particular video from the press club, and I can't even recall if it was from 2022 or 2025, where Clive's talking about the 15% iron ore tariff, inverted commas, because he didn't call it that back in 2022. So he had a policy back in 2022 to put a 15% levy on external iron ore sold overseas. And it worked out that in the first year, it would return something of the order, let me think what it was. I think it was $30 billion. It was a massive amount of money. And so when you compared that to $1 trillion in debt, the argument was that you could use just this 15% extra fee on top of our iron ore, and that would eventually pay down the $1 trillion over a period of time. So when you add inflation and the rising costs, etc., 15%, you might pay it off in 20 years. But it was a way to pay off this $1 trillion government debt through just using our resources. And of course, no major party picked up on it, and they pretended it wasn't a real thing. And so people would argue, but hang on a second, you can't charge an extra 15%. Well, look what Trump's doing. He's telling everyone that you're going to pay, rather than charging them a fee, it's a tariff, which means that where the product is headed, the people will pay extra. So you want to sell your car into the United States, 25% tariff on the top. Obviously, that gets passed on and you pay a higher price, but that's reflected by Trump's plans to lower taxes, etc., and of course bring manufacturing into the country. So it's a shift there, and so that you want to produce locally, and then you don't pay the tariff, so it's an advantage to a local manufacturer, etc. So Clive argued on the iron ore that the purpose was that China was buying our iron ore well into the future, decades into the future. They'd already booked it, etc. And of course, our iron ore is considered to be the best in the world. So if they want to go and buy cheaper steel somewhere else, it's going to be crap. It's no good. So they're going to just have to pay for it. And that was the interesting part of it, that when you're dealing in billionaire row, you're not dealing with people that don't know what they're talking about in their areas of expertise. Some may say Clive's not an expert in politics, and that's why he's not winning seats. And there is that. But when it comes to mining, there's no question that the billionaire is well versed in how to put deals together when it comes to iron ore. So you'd be well versed to consider what Clive's saying about a policy there, as opposed to Kevin Rudd, who wanted to put a 1% tax on the mineral mining resources. And that's exactly why Clive got involved in politics in the first place back in 2013, and he was elected, and that policy of Rudd's was eventually defeated. Rudd, of course, himself had been defeated in 2010 by his own Julia Gillard in that party. For a bit more of that history lesson. Maybe it's this section of the show is why AI thinks I'm a history teacher, Nicola.
It's funny that people get their panties in a bind about tariffs, because here in Australia we've been the victim of tariffs, for a long time. For instance, a couple of examples, and it's not really the same anymore because all cars seem to be made or assembled in China or India now. But for the longest time, if you wanted a European car in Australia, it was very, very expensive. You paid extra for that privilege because you were getting a European car. But and it's not so much like that anymore. But in recent years, I'm sure you can all remember, listeners, where, China cracked the shits. I think it was in the middle of the pandemic, where they suddenly put all these very large tariffs on Australian wine, and they did the same thing really that Trump's doing. They were using tariffs to, achieve an end goal, and no one was outraged about that. Everyone still keeps buying their Chinese products. No one calls for the unseating of the dictator Xi Jinping. And it's like when they're on the left, everything they do is absolutely fine and justified, and then when those on the right try and do the same thing, there's absolute outrage. And I just find it really interesting. A pundit actually tweeted out on X this morning, a financial expert, that BlackRock and Vanguard at this point in history now, and God knows where this is going to go soon, currently own between them 88% of the stock market. 88%, Jason. If that's true, there is a new one world government.
Well, it's matched by that way, isn't it? I mean, when we say own, they're funds managers, so it's not all their money directly. It's all the people that invest with them.
Control is the same as that. Yeah.
And so therefore it certainly affects decisions, and no different to if you want to look at it from a slightly different angle. If you take Bernie Madoff and his company, the great Ponzi scheme that went down for billions and billions of dollars, nobody dared question Bernie Madoff when they got their returns every month, even though it was a scam. And authorities would always look the other way at the exact right time. It's almost as if they knew, but they didn't want to know. And this is one of those scenarios. It's until something else breaks. Now, the thing about tariffs, right, is that people think tariffs, higher costs, bad. But if you are a nationalist and not a globalist, you must understand that the moment that the word tariff is uttered, that is a weapon that shoots into the very heart of globalism, because globalism is built on free trade and taking away all the barriers. And what it does is that it sounds great, free trade, you take away all the taxes on different goods. But what it does do is it provides massive economic advantage to those that pay the lowest wages, China and India and other countries in what they call the global south, used to be called the third world. So anywhere where you have cheap labor is where companies using globalism as their great big overarching banner that they all get behind, take away the jobs. So think of Australia and the brand, I'm thinking of Bonds clothing, for example, and when they finally went overseas to manufacture. So they go to China. So that makes them more price competitive. But what does it do? It takes away the jobs here in Australia. And Australia, as we know, has become a service country. We don't manufacture.
And it promotes slave labor, Jason, in those countries.
And as well. So the opposite holds. So if you can introduce a tariff, what you're doing is you're rebalancing. So you're saying, okay, we no longer want to import Chinese motor vehicles for $15,000. We'd like to build them here in Australia. And if we can build them to a different quality, then we're going to manufacture them and sell them for $25,000 in a few years' time, which obviously will be the next model up, etc. Now, people will say, well, that's not fair. Well, I'm going to make this point. This is, again, stretching it out a little bit. Everyone in Australia who is someone who's at least the age of 40 or older will remember when Hyundai came to this country back in the late 1980s. And it was about 4 or 5 years, maybe it was a bit longer, 6 or 7 years, that they introduced the Hyundai XL, the little two-door bubbly-looking car, which was a derivative of the Mazda 121. And this car got Hyundai on the map, and it was every car was $13,990 drive away. That's all you ever heard on the radio, the TV, etc., etc., etc. And there would have been a million of these things driving around. And there's always been a situation in Australia. There's always been one really good cheap car that's quite captured the imagination. So Hyundai was known as the alternative to the Japanese brands, being that it was from South Korea, and it was this interim motor vehicle. Now, it was an okay car. It wasn't particularly wonderful, but it was very, very popular, no different to the Mazda 121 previously and how that popular that car became. The Volkswagen Beetle's another one of these cult vehicles that was around forever and ever and ever and sold, hundreds of millions of models, etc. But you fast forward into the 2010 period, and I'll never forget one of the marketing directors or the CEO of Hyundai coming out and saying, we're no longer focusing on undercutting the opposition. We believe that we're better than this. And now we're going to match or meet the market in terms of pricing. And overnight, cars like the Hyundai Santa Fe, which used to be a $29,990 or even a $39,990 fully loaded SUV, was suddenly selling in the $50,000 mark. Now, I had cause a couple of weeks ago to walk into my local car dealership, and I thought I've never walked on the lot of a Kia dealership. I just want to go and see these things because every day it seems on the road you see another one of these cars, and they are new. Like Nissan, as I talked about, the same look for a decade never changes. You look at Kia, every day there's another car on there. You go, what's that? Oh, it's a Kia. Which model's that? I walk onto the lot and every car's got a sticker on the window and 69,000 marked down to 64,000. First of all, nearly fell over that a Kia was $65,000 on sale. And you look inside expecting to see, through the roof sunroof, leathers materials, screens all around and all this great stuff. And I look inside of a car for 64,000 bucks, cloth seats. I'm like, are you serious? How much is the car with leather? Are you paying 80,000 bucks for a Kia with an upmarket interior? My point being that things change over time, and we no longer are concerned about paying 13,990 or 23,990 for our Kia. People are perhaps paying big money for this stuff. Now, if that Kia was then sold in Australia and we put a tariff on it, then it would actually be that you would sell that car for that price, and the imported Kia would be $74,000 by comparison, or $84,000 because of the tariff. So is there anyone in Australia that wouldn't want a car manufacturing industry again? Is there anyone in Australia that wouldn't want a Holden Commodore or the latest, let's call it a Ford Territory reinvented, built here on our soil, to have Toyota Camrys built again? Maybe you could manufacture Toyota RAV4s, our number one country. We'd have an Australian-made Toyota RAV4. We used to build the Toyota Camry in Australia. We used to build the Mitsubishi Magna and the Mitsubishi 380 in recent history until it was Joe Hockey that made that impossible to do. Of course, we built Holden Commodores and some of the other Holdens, but most of those were imported. We did build the Ford Falcon here in Australia. Wouldn't it be amazing if we were to build the Ford Mustang here in Australia? In Australia, I think people wouldn't want that because you want the genuine American original. But there are other cars that you could be able to build here again. And there wouldn't be anyone that wouldn't want to have that scenario here in Australia. Wouldn't it be amazing if Hyundai were actually manufacturing on Australian soil? And it turns out they're going to manufacture back on US soil. And that means that there'll be two-tier pricing. So what would you do if you're in the US today? You could go and buy a Hyundai imported from South Korea. Over there, the prices are much cheaper, and maybe you get that new brand new Santa Fe that's here's 80 grand. Over there, you get it for 45, or you get it built locally for 35,000 bucks. Who
Yeah.
wouldn't want to do that again?
Well, I know that customers who look at Jeeps, the Jeep Grand Cherokee, a lot of Canadians who live in Australia are always shocked because it's approximately, like a 80, 90, 100 grand prospect here. And in Canada, they're two a penny, and you can get a Grand Cherokee for 30 grand. So they're always a bit like, what? That's enormous. But there is a sea change actually in Australia with car manufacturing, not manufacturing per se. And again, it is thanks to America. So what's happened is there's a couple of brands. One of them is the Ram truck, if you like a big pickup. But what they're doing is because American cars are quite popular, because the roads in Australia are very similar, the setup, and we do still have a lot of rural areas that people need to go to in Australia. What there is now is a soft manufacturing returning to Australia. So what's happening is America, which is wonderful, and I'm sure this is something to do with Trump. America has allowed Australia to have a license to take these American vehicles built in America, Jason. So you're still supporting American manufacturing, to open up plants in Australia. And there's one in Clayton in Melbourne, actually, that employs a whole bunch of people. And they have the permission, the license to take the tops off these vehicles and make them right-hand drive. And then they reassemble them and put them back. Now, I know that's not manufacturing the car in Australia, but it's something. So if you don't want to buy a Chinese car or a Korean car, and you want to support sort of America and Australia, I would recommend jumping into an American car at this point because, well, firstly, you get that American vroom vroom. They still have the decent engines, which I know you and I are fans of, Jason. For me, driving is an experience, not just to, plug in your electric car and get from A to B. But you are actually supporting a bit of Australian manufacturing, and I think that's interesting that people are being employed. Interestingly, when I lived in America, they don't say Hyundai, they say Hyundai. Oh, you
Yes.
drive a Hyundai. And I'm like, why have you dropped the Y? What the hell is going on in America? But also on the leather seats thing, and people do pay a lot more money. They go up a spec, essentially. You're going to the HSE, the high spec extras, when you get all the leather seats and the screens. And I've talked before, I don't like these iPad screens in cars. I don't like leather seats. I don't think they work in Australia, to be honest, because on a hot day, when you get in on a leather seat, it burns your bum. So I don't think I don't think you need to pay the extra and get the leather seats. I've got material seats in my old 4x4 and it's fantastic. But it's interesting, right? That there are ways. I think, after your home, your car is your next big purchase, right? And it is your second home. Most of us treat it like an office. I think it's really important that you think about this stuff. And I don't think Australians realize when they grab an American car, Australian hands have been on that. They've disassembled it and they've made it right-hand drive and they've reassembled it. I find that really interesting, Jason, and it's something for people to think about.
Well, Mustang Australia imports obviously Mustangs directly, and these guys are responsible for the Shelbys and the upmarket ones. Well, they have a license too to build the Shelby spec here in Australia. I find that fascinating as well. And what
Mm.
happens, of course, is that when this happens, you have a secondary market that those that can't afford to spend $200,000 on a Shelby upgrade, they will copy the same spec and have a non-Shelby version using the same materials and be able to create that market as well. So whilst you might not be manufacturing the entire motor vehicle here, the Mustang was made to be a modified car. That's what it is. That's its specialty, and
Mm.
I think that's a really big deal. By the way, my 2013 Chrysler 300 has ventilated leather seats, Nicola. So
Ventilated. Come on, people like.
you
Do you know
press
what people ask for now? They ask for a heated steering wheel. And I think you're so spoiled. Who needs a heated bloody steering wheel? Put a pair of gloves on, mate. Act like a normal person. Now, I
well,
think we've well and truly done the car segment today. You're welcome, car people. I just want to ask you. I'm sure you know who Professor Jeffrey David Sachs is, Jason. I'm sure
yep.
you know. Wonderful guy. His clips are all over social media at the moment. But there was one quote that someone put up on TikTok, and now it's gone crazy on X from him. And he said very clearly, and I'm sure the powers that be don't like this man very much. He said, superpowers tell super lies. The Iraq war was a lie. The WMDs were a lie because the WMDs, and he's got proof and he's written about it in a book, the whole concept of weapons of mass destruction was actually originated from a focus group idea at the Pentagon. So it just goes to show how much we're propagandized, right? Because I also fell for the lie of WMDs in Iraq. And now I realize that wasn't the case. And, we were very angry in the UK because Blair supported Bush on Operation Shock and Awe, and a million Iraqis, probably families, were slaughtered for no reason. But what can we do in the future? I mean, if these things are coming out as essentially marketing material and they're not true, and then we get involved in this military industrial complex, and our politicians here in Australia, haven't they just sent a big lump of money again over to Ukraine? What is going on?
Well, it's Jeffrey Sachs is the one that's pointed out the anomalies in the whole narrative with Ukraine, and explaining Russia's position. So I find that fascinating that Sachs again is pointing out this nonsense that's going on. But this again is well, look at the scenario there. So how do you have Tony Blair, okay, former UK Prime Minister, Labor, left wing, supporting George Bush, Republican, right wing? So
Yes.
what you're seeing straight away is,
Mm.
and of course there's cooperation across countries, but
Special
something as obvious as that.
relationship. Oh, yeah, they told us we've got a special relationship. And you know what? They took the piss out of that special relationship in the movie. Oh, what's that movie at Christmas that came out that everyone loves with Hugh, what's his face in it? Love Actually. So
Yes.
there's great scenes in there where the British PM pushes back against the US president because also he's a creep, of course. But it was actually taking the piss out of, we were constantly told for years and years, we've got a special relationship, do we? And in that, Hugh Grant says, I think this special relationship has become a bit one-sided because, yes, you're right. Why was Blair, lefty, Labour, new Labour in the UK? Why was he in bed with what we now call the far right George Bush?
There you go. And of course, that the other thing that came up when this coalition of the willing that John Howard was happy to take part in, a right wing or conservative, at least centre right here in Australia, was that France said, no, we're not going to be involved. And of course, the Americans lost their minds over this and decided to rename French fries freedom fries for
Oh,
that
yeah.
period of time. And of course, France is perennially left wing. So one would argue, why wouldn't the left of France join the left of the UK? So there were other hostilities across the water, would you believe it, between these two countries. So, of course, today they've all become globalists. And this is interesting because it brings up the story of this Ian Bremmer, the president of the Eurasia Group that I mentioned in the news, this high powered consulting firm, publishing their analysis of the transatlantic relationship between Trump and of course with Canada, etc. And what are you saying? That he expects Ottawa will quietly fold shortly after the vote to ensure that ongoing relations remain functional. And what he said was that America's largest trade partners, Mexico and Canada, are facing more significant trade pressures from the Trump administration, but the imbalance of power is such that they have no credible strategy to push back. He writes, everyone understands that they'll have to accept Trump's terms eventually. The only question is whether capitulation comes before or after a costly fight. So, riding an 85% job approval, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has enough domestic political space to yield to Trump's demands to keep Mexico in his good graces, as she's already doing. But he says, by contrast, Canadian leaders have a political incentive to put up a bigger fight because Trump's threats towards Canada's economy, now ready for this, and sovereignty have sharply inflamed nationalist sentiment north of the border in the run-up to the April 28 elections. Sovereignty and inflamed nationalist sentiment. So there you go. I said it earlier,
Wow.
and now it's Ian Bremmer's confirming it. Tariffs have defeated globalism. That's what they're actually there to do. And so what's going to happen is that he's now created a hierarchy, and he's showing you that America is the strongest country in the world based on its economic prowess. And he's going to pull these countries into line, and he was offering them the ultimate carrot. Come aboard, become the 51st and 52nd state, and you avoid this, which he knew that they would not do, and he doesn't really want them to do it. And if he did, he's creating America's version of a one world government, which is going to put the fear of God into people. But of course, that's not what it's about. What he is doing is he is restoring nationalism, and he's defeating globalism through a bunch of sucker punches that no one saw coming. I think the man is a genius because of the way that he's always able. It's like you fake one
Everyone's
way and you
screaming
go
at
the
their
other way.
phones now. Everyone's screaming at their phones because they're always like, Jason's too much of a Trump guy. But, this globalism versus nationalism is absolutely huge, isn't it? Because they're such hypocrites, right? They talk about globalization, and then Schwab and I think Biden as well, they both basically said the same marketing line. They said, we admire a rising China, and at the same time, we must get to net zero. But they never tell China to get to net zero because they're guffing out their carbon because they know it's absolutely fine and makes plants grow. Have you seen how green the countryside is in China? Even though they're moving everyone into the urban spaces. And they're such hypocrites. And you've got to ask yourself, what is their end goal, that they tell the rest of us that we have to adhere to these ridiculous mandates, whether they be vaccine mandates or net zero mandates? I mean, it's still going on in Australia. There are papers being put together saying you can't do this and you can't do that, and because of net zero. And of course they're using the indigenous tribes to, we read one out yesterday, a councillor's put an entire town that has no indigenous population, it's 100% white, under this corporation, by the way, a private corporation that just happens to have an Aboriginal name. That's how they do it. So you think, this is all part of net zero. No, it's not. This is the corporatization of Australia. I mean, it does feel now like they are absolutely trying to turn us into China. But the thing is, if they're trying to turn us into China in this soft communism, then let's really be like China. Let's open up more coal mines the way China are. Let's guff out our carbon the way China are. Let's shut down our borders and not let people migrate there the way China are. I mean, if we were China, all of these new Australians that are arriving, we'd be chucking them in slave camps just because they're different. That's what China does. So you're telling us you want us to be more like China, but only on certain things, not
Well,
on the human rights issue. What the hell is going on?
Well, it's so true. And the other thing is, when you think about it, right? So the black rocks of the world that control everything are very happy that China doesn't have to play the net zero game because what does it do? It keeps the costs down. So when we import everything back out of China, it keeps the profit margins high and it keeps all the Chinese goods ultra competitive because they're always the cheapest. You've only got to walk into the big hardware stores and look at the label of everything, and everything is made in China. And you wonder why you're going back there 12 months later to buy it again because it's broken. Now, it's interesting because China's wages bill is low. People are working in, Apple factories, etc., for a couple of bucks an hour. Now, here it is. You are not even allowed to work for $10 an hour in Australia if you wanted to take it. Now, I'm not saying anyone would do it, but I'm saying it's illegal to work under
Yeah.
the award rate. And you can't employ somebody and say, listen, I can't employ you for the full rate, but I can pay you $10 an hour, but at least it's better than nothing. That would be illegal. You would be an employer that'd be thrown into jail. Don't you
Yeah.
think that's weird? Now, if you were an innovator, and you were saying, look, my choices are that I get nothing because I can't qualify for Centrelink or whatever, and I don't want to take charity, but I would be prepared to work under the award wage for a particular employer that allowed me to work in a certain way. And here's just an example of a structure. So $10 an hour, you might say, well, an 18-year-old kid says, well, I'm at uni, I'll just go and work a day and I'll make $80 and I'm happy with that. I'll work on the weekend and maybe make $160. Who knows what people need to do? And this is just purely just an argument. And then all of a sudden you realize that the factory worker produces X amount of output per day for the $80 or whatever they're getting paid. And so this person says, well, you know what? I can innovate on the output that you're requiring to manufacture of this particular product that you're making, and you're going to allow me to manufacture this at home, for example. And so I can take a little bit home and I can tool up and whatever, and I can get my family members to be involved. And suddenly, this is a mini factory, like a cottage industry working out of the home garage
They
in a
did that
rental
in
property.
England. They did that in England in the 70s. It was called outwork. And they used to give all the mums that were at home these little machines to make like nails and washers and stuff like that. And they'd put the metal in and go clunk click, and they'd make another one and clunk click. And that's what they were doing. And, it was non-stop. So, yeah, that's interesting that you say that. And also, just to add to my other point, right? DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Where's China's diversity, equity, and inclusion? They don't have it because if you're different or diverse in China, you go into a slave camp, right? So these people, these globalists are hypocrites, right? Because if globalization had been something that works and that is fair and makes life better, and we just heard today that apparently Australians are not going to be able to fly. I think the CEO of Qantas has said that flying is only going to be for the privileged. Well, considering we're this massive isolated rock in the southern hemisphere, that's absolutely great for young Australians. They won't be going anywhere. But there's no DEI in China. There's no mass migration into China. There's mass migration. China's massive. There's mass migration onto the tiny island of England, the UK, the British Isles. So none of this makes sense. Now, we are getting towards the end of the show, Jason. I'm a little bit annoyed because I wanted to talk today, but maybe we'll do it Monday. I think human beings need to become a protected species. We've got loads of protected species on this planet. You can have a strange little worm or a little silverfish that's a protected species, meaning that, you can't farm near a river and you can't dig a mine or this, that, and the other because of these protected species. We should be a protected species. And if we become a protected species, that's the end of globalization. That's the end of 15-minute cities. That's the end of vaccine mandates. That's the end of all of it, Jason. So let's on this show go for a big push on making human beings protected. What would you like to say before we go?
Think we're going to need another species to be able to make that ruling to protect us, the little people that can't defend themselves. And
Dogs.
that's
Dogs will support that.
well, there you have it. We maybe that's what's going to happen next in the next election. We may have a non-human species running for parliament. Who knows?
Raise your paw. Your
Look,
human gets up every day, goes to work so it can feed you and walk you and give you a lovely soft place to live. I think dogs would raise their paw for the protection of the human species. I really do.
yeah, well, there it is. And look, we expect by the time we return here on Monday, an election would have been called here in Australia, which we expect to happen on May the 3rd. That means it's game on. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful weekend. And on the other side, as we then march towards the great big poll that's coming, whether we have a conversation about who you're going to support, how you're going to support, and what it is that we can do to affect some change, or at the very least, learn what we need to do to get up after this one and march towards 2028 as we get organised, as the new Australia First Alliance becomes more than it was, the consolidation amongst the third parties, and once and for all, we'll realise what we're dealing with now, nationalism versus globalism, and it is divided for all the world to see. We'll pick a side and remember that the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And next week, I'll discuss a little bit more, tiny bit more, how you could do a really interesting thing when these elections come along. If you vote for a certain person from the Australia First Alliance, you'll actually be voting for the second person in that chain to be my husband. So I'll announce that next week. He's again dipping his toe into politics after running for the Senate in 2022. Why? Because we are rallying for all the good guys to either be in media the way we are, get up early, make an effort and do community radio for you guys, or make an effort and dip their toe into politics and try and make a difference. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Australian on Friday. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. From myself, Nicola Charles, and my co-host and co-producer, Jason Olborn, we will see you all over again, nice and refreshed on Monday.